The crash lasted less than 3 seconds. The silence afterward lasted years. One moment, Ethan Blackwell was driving through the rain with his wife beside him. The next, his world ceased to exist. It was 11:48 p.m. Rain hammered against the windshield as Ethan guided the black sedan down a nearly empty highway. Beside him sat Claire, his wife, his best friend, the woman who had stood beside him long before the money, the success, and the billion-dollar company that now carried his name. Tonight was special. It was their 15th wedding anniversary. The dinner had been perfect. The conversation had been easy. And for the first time in months, Ethan had allowed himself to forget about business. For just a few hours, he had simply been a husband. Claire was laughing about something that had happened at dinner. Ethan couldn't remember the joke. Years later, he would try desperately to remember. But grief has a cruel habit of preserving feelings while stealing details. He remembered her smile. He remembered her voice. He remembered thinking he was the luckiest man alive. Then everything changed. A pair of headlights appeared through the rain. Too bright, too fast, too close. At first, Ethan assumed the truck would correct itself. It didn't. The vehicle drifted across the center line. Straight toward them. Ethan flashed his lights. Nothing. He honked. Nothing. The truck continued coming. For one terrifying second, he saw the driver's face. And what he saw made no sense. The man wasn't frightened. Wasn't panicked. Wasn't trying to avoid the collision. He looked calm. Almost as if this was exactly where he intended to be. Then the truck slammed into them. Metal screamed. Glass exploded. The world spun violently. And darkness swallowed everything. When Ethan opened his eyes again, for days had vanished. The first thing he tried to do was move his legs. They didn't move. The second thing he did was ask for Claire. Nobody answered. The look on his sister-in-law's face told him everything before a single word was spoken. Claire was gone. His wife had died at the scene. And as Ethan stared at the hospital ceiling, unable to feel his legs and unable to understand how his life had fallen apart in a single night, he believed the crash was a tragic accident. He was wrong, because somewhere outside that hospital room, someone was breathing easier. Someone who had expected Ethan to die. Someone who believed their secret would remain buried forever. But secrets have a way of surviving. And this one was about to destroy an entire family. Welcome to Super Storytelling. Before we continue, we'd love to know where you're watching from today. Are you joining us from the United States, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, South Africa, New Zealand, the Caribbean, or somewhere else around the world? Tell us your country and city in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel and where our amazing viewers are listening from. And if you enjoy emotional stories filled with mystery, family drama, shocking twists, and unforgettable endings, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Now let's continue Ethan Blackwell's story. Because the worst part of his nightmare hadn't even begun yet. When Ethan Blackwell was discharged from the hospital 6 weeks later, hundreds of people seemed determined to help him. Doctors prepared rehabilitation plans. Physical therapists discussed recovery goals. Business partners offered support. Friends sent flowers, cards, and messages. For a while, the attention was overwhelming. Then little by little, it began to fade. Because life has a habit of moving forward, even when someone else's world has stopped. The Blackwell estate sat on 12 acres overlooking a quiet lake. Before the accident, it had been a place filled with movement. Claire loved hosting people. Birthdays, holiday dinners, charity events, weekend gatherings. There was always music somewhere in the house. Always laughter. Always life. Now the mansion felt different. The silence seemed to stretch across every hallway. Every room carried a memory. Every memory carried pain. The first morning Ethan woke up in the house, he found himself staring at Claire's coffee mug. It was still sitting on the kitchen counter, exactly where she had left it. Nobody had touched it. Nobody knew whether they should. The mug remained there for 3 weeks. Every time Ethan saw it, something inside him cracked a little more. The worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was the reminders. Her scarf hanging near the door. Her gardening gloves by the back patio. Her favorite blanket folded over a chair in the family room. Tiny pieces of a life that no longer existed. The house felt less like a home, and more like a museum dedicated to someone he couldn't stop missing. At first, Ethan tried to be cooperative. He attended therapy sessions. He listened to doctors. He followed schedules. But grief is exhausting, and exhaustion slowly became anger. The first caregiver lasted 5 days. The second lasted 8. The third resigned after 2 weeks. Each departure followed the same pattern. Someone would try to encourage him. Someone would tell him recovery was possible. Someone would talk about hope. And Ethan would shut down completely. Hope felt offensive. Hope implied the possibility of getting something back. But the one thing he wanted back was impossible. No amount of therapy could bring Claire home. By the end of the second month, 6 caregivers had quit. By the end of the third month, 11 were gone. Word spread quickly. Working for Ethan Blackwell became the kind of job people warned each other about. The billionaire wasn't cruel. He wasn't violent. He wasn't abusive. He was simply unreachable, like a man trapped behind thick glass. No matter what anyone said, they couldn't get through. One rainy afternoon, Ethan sat alone in his study watching water slide down the windows. His wheelchair faced the garden. Claire's garden. Rows of roses stretched across the property. She had planted most of them herself. Years ago, she had convinced Ethan to spend an entire weekend helping her. He had complained constantly. She had laughed the entire time. Now weeds had begun creeping between the flower beds. The roses were slowly being overtaken. Just like everything else. A knock sounded at the door. "Come in." His cousin Marcus stepped inside. Marcus Reed had been helping manage company operations since the accident. Tall, confident, and always perfectly dressed, Marcus had become Ethan's closest family member after Claire's death. At least that's what everyone believed. Marcus carried a folder beneath one arm. "How are you feeling today?" Ethan stared out the window. "Terrible." Marcus forced a sympathetic smile. "That's progress. Last week you said miserable." Ethan didn't laugh. Marcus sat across from him. For several minutes they discussed company matters. Contracts. Investments. Board meetings. Numbers. Profits. The language of business. Once upon a time, Ethan loved these conversations. Now they felt meaningless. Eventually Marcus closed the folder. "You know," he said carefully, "Claire wouldn't want this." Ethan's jaw tightened immediately. Marcus noticed, but continued anyway. "She wouldn't want you sitting in here every day." The room grew colder. "Don't. Makusait. I'm just saying." "I said don't." The words came out sharper than Ethan intended. Marcus raised both hands. "Okay." Silence followed. A long, uncomfortable silence. Finally Marcus stood. "I'll come back next week." Ethan nodded. Marcus walked toward the door. Then paused. "You still have people who care about you." After Marcus left, Ethan sat motionless for nearly an hour. The comment bothered him. Not because it was wrong. Because it was right. People did care. The problem was that caring wasn't enough. Nobody understood what it felt like to wake up every morning and immediately remember the worst day of your life. Nobody understood the guilt. The endless guilt. Because no matter what anyone said, Ethan couldn't escape one simple fact. He had been driving. Claire had died. The equation never changed. That night sleep refused to come. Around 2 in the morning, Ethan wheeled himself through the dark hallways of the mansion. The house felt enormous. Empty. Almost haunted. As he passed the guest wing, he noticed a light glowing beneath a partially opened office door. He frowned. The room should have been empty. Slowly, he moved closer. Voices drifted through the gap. One belonged to Marcus. The other belonged to someone Ethan couldn't identify. "He's getting worse," the stranger said. Marcus lowered his voice. "We just need more time. What if he starts asking questions?" "He won't." There was confidence in Marcus's tone. Too much confidence. Ethan moved closer, trying to hear more. Suddenly a floorboard creaked beneath his wheelchair. The voices stopped instantly. Silence. Then footsteps. Approaching. Ethan quickly turned his wheelchair and moved away down the hallway before the door opened. His heart pounded. A few moments later he heard someone step into the corridor behind him. Watching. Waiting. By the time Ethan reached the corner, the hallway was empty again. He told himself it meant nothing. Probably business matters. Probably private company discussions. Probably. But as he lay awake later that night staring at the ceiling, one thought refused to leave him. For the first time since the accident, something felt wrong. Not sad. Not painful. Wrong. And miles away, in a small apartment on the other side of the city, a struggling widow named Sarah Collins was about to see a job advertisement that would change all of their lives forever. 3 months after Ethan Blackwell's life fell apart, Sarah Collins was sitting at a kitchen table trying to figure out which bill she could afford not to pay. It was a decision she had become far too familiar with. The electricity bill sat beside the rent notice. The rent notice sat beside a grocery receipt, and none of the numbers looked good. Sarah rubbed her forehead and closed her eyes. Across the room, her 8-year-old son, Noah, was helping his younger sister, Emma, color pictures at the coffee table. They were laughing. Children had a remarkable ability to find joy even when adults were drowning in worry. Sarah envied them for that. 3 years earlier, her life had looked completely different. She had been married, happy, comfortable, not wealthy but comfortable. Her husband, Daniel, worked as a school counselor. Sarah worked part-time at a childcare center. Together, they had built a simple life. The kind of life people often overlook because nothing dramatic happens. No luxury vacations. No expensive cars. No giant houses. Just family dinners. Movie nights. School concerts. And the quiet certainty that tomorrow would look a lot like today. Then Daniel got sick. At first, it seemed manageable. A few tests. A few appointments. A few medications. Then more tests. More appointments. More medications. Within a year, their entire world revolved around hospitals. Sarah sold her jewelry. Then their second car. Then most of their savings. Daniel fought harder than anyone she had ever known. But sometimes effort isn't enough. Sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes life takes what it wants anyway. Daniel died on a cold Thursday morning. The doctors were kind. The nurses were compassionate. None of it changed the outcome. One day Sarah was a wife. The next she was a widow with 2 children and a future she no longer recognized. The years that followed were difficult. Not dramatic. Not tragic in the way movies portray tragedy. Just exhausting. The kind of exhaustion that accumulates quietly. One overdue payment at a time. One unexpected expense at a time. One sleepless night at a time. Sarah worked wherever she could. Daycare centers. Reception desks. Temporary contracts. Weekend shifts. Anything that helped keep food on the table. But every time she started to get ahead, something happened. A company closed. Hours were reduced. A contract ended. The result was always the same. She remained stuck. Surviving. Never advancing. Now she stared at the final notice from her landlord. The message was simple. Pay within 30 days or vacate the property. Sarah looked toward her children. Neither of them knew how serious things had become. She intended to keep it that way. Noah suddenly held up a drawing. "Mom." Sarah smiled. "Yes. What do you think?" He walked over and handed her the paper. It showed a small house. A tree. A smiling family standing together. 4 stick figures. Sarah, Noah, Emma, and Daniel. The sight hit her harder than she expected. Even after 3 years, her children still drew their father into every picture. As if part of them believed he might somehow come back. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Noah grinned. Emma pointed proudly at the tallest figure. "That's Daddy." Sarah nodded. "I know." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Emma asked the question Sarah feared most. "Do you think Daddy can see us?" Sarah swallowed. Every parent eventually faces moments where there is no perfect answer. Only the least painful one. "I think he loves you very much." Emma seemed satisfied with that. She returned to coloring. Sarah stared at the drawing a little longer, then quietly folded it and placed it beside the bills. Later that afternoon, after dropping the children off at school activities, Sarah stopped by the local employment center. She wasn't expecting much. Just another search. Another application. Another rejection waiting somewhere in the future. She walked past dozens of postings. Retail. Cleaning services. Warehouse work. Reception positions. Then one advertisement caught her attention. Live-in caregiver needed. Private residence. Immediate start. Excellent compensation. Sarah read it twice. Then a third time. Something about the salary seemed unreal. The amount was more than she had earned in several months combined. A man standing nearby noticed her staring. His expression changed. "You thinking about applying for that?" Sarah looked up. "Maybe." The man laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it wasn't. "Good luck." "What does that mean?" "You don't know who it's for?" Sarah shook her head. The man pointed toward the advertisement. "That's Ethan Blackwell." Immediately she recognized the name. Almost everyone did. The billionaire developer. The man whose accident had made national headlines. The man people constantly discussed on television. The man whose wife had died. Oh, the man nodded. Exactly. Sarah looked back at the posting. The man lowered his voice. I heard he's gone through 11 caregivers already. 11? That's what people are saying. Sarah frowned. Why? The man shrugged. Apparently he's impossible. Sarah stared at the paper. Impossible. Normally that would have been enough to make her walk away. But normal people weren't facing eviction. Normal people weren't calculating grocery purchases down to the dollar. Normal people weren't trying to raise 2 children while carrying the weight of grief and survival at the same time. The truth was simple. She didn't have the luxury of being afraid. She needed the job. And sometimes desperation makes decisions that courage never could. Sarah took out a pen from her handbag. The cap was cracked. The ink barely worked. But eventually she managed to write down the number. As she turned to leave, the man called after her. If you get it, let me know how long you last. Sarah smiled politely, then walked away. That evening, after the children were asleep, she sat alone at the kitchen table and dialed the number. A calm voice answered. Blackwell Estate. Arthur speaking. Sarah straightened instinctively. Hello. I'm calling about the caregiver position. There was a brief pause. Then the man sighed. Not rudely. More like someone preparing for another difficult conversation. May I ask your name? Sarah Collins. Mrs. Collins, before we continue, I believe honesty is important. Sarah listened carefully. The position is challenging. How challenging? Another pause. The man chose his words carefully. The previous 11 caregivers would probably describe it as impossible. Sarah looked toward the hallway where her children slept. Then she looked at the overdue bills. And finally at Daniel's photograph sitting on the table. I'd still like an interview. For the first time, the man sounded slightly surprised. Very well. He gave her an address. A date. A time. As the call ended, Sarah placed the phone down slowly. Outside, rain tapped softly against the apartment windows. Inside, the silence felt heavy. Because deep down, she had a strange feeling. A feeling she couldn't explain. As though the phone call she had just made was the beginning of something much larger than a job. Something that would change her life. And somewhere across the city, Ethan Blackwell sat alone in a dark mansion, completely unaware that the woman who was about to walk through his front door would uncover secrets buried far deeper than either of them could imagine. The morning of the interview arrived gray and cold. Sarah barely slept the night before. Not because she was nervous, because she couldn't afford not to get the job. There was a difference. Nervousness came from uncertainty. Desperation came from necessity. And necessity had a way of pushing fear aside. By 8 o'clock, Noah and Emma were at school. By 8:30, Sarah was standing at a bus stop clutching a folder that contained her resume, references, and every certification she had earned over the years. She checked them 3 times during the journey. Not because she needed to, because it gave her something to do besides worry. 40 minutes later, the bus stopped near the edge of one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city. Sarah stepped off and immediately understood why the salary was so high. The homes here weren't houses. They were estates. The kind of properties people admired through magazine pages. The kind of places children pointed at from car windows. The kind of places that existed in a completely different world from hers. She followed the address until she reached a pair of black iron gates. Beyond them stood the Blackwell estate. For a moment, Sarah simply stared. The mansion looked less like a home and more like a luxury hotel. 3 stories. Stone exterior. Large windows overlooking the lake. Perfect landscaping. Perfect architecture. Perfect everything. Except it wasn't perfect. Not really. Because even from the entrance, Sarah could see signs of neglect. The rose garden looked overgrown. Several flower beds needed attention. Something about the property felt abandoned. Not physically. Emotionally. As if the house itself was grieving. A voice interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Collins? She turned. An older gentleman stood beside the gate. Tall. Well-dressed. Gray-haired. Professional. He extended a hand. Arthur Bennett. The household manager? That's correct. His handshake was firm but polite. The kind of handshake that immediately inspired trust. Arthur led her through the gates and toward the house. As they walked, Sarah noticed how quiet everything felt. No gardeners. No staff moving around. No signs of activity. The estate felt strangely frozen in time, almost as if everyone inside was afraid to make too much noise. Arthur opened the front door. The interior was even more impressive. High ceilings, marble floors, large chandeliers, expensive artwork. Yet despite all the wealth surrounding her, Sarah couldn't shake one feeling: loneliness. The house felt lonely. Arthur seemed to notice her expression. It wasn't always like this. Sarah looked at him. He smiled sadly. Mrs. Blackwell had a gift for making a large house feel like a home. The silence that followed said everything else. They continued through several hallways until they reached a closed wooden door. Arthur stopped. "This is the study." Sarah took a breath. Arthur turned toward her. What happened next surprised her. The older man's expression became serious. Very serious. "I want to give you some advice." Sarah nodded. "Mr. Blackwell is not a bad man." The statement seemed oddly specific. Arthur continued. "Many people think he is. But he's not. What is he then?" Arthur looked at the door. "A man in pain." The answer lingered between them. Sarah understood immediately, because she had known pain too. Not the same pain, but pain nonetheless. Arthur glanced at his watch. "He'll speak with you for 3 minutes." Sarah blinked. 3 minutes. Arthur nodded. "He times interviews." "Seriously?" "I'm afraid so." Despite herself, Sarah almost laughed. Arthur didn't. "One more thing." "What?" "If he asks you to leave, leave." Sarah frowned. That's it. That's it." She looked at the closed door, then back at Arthur. "What happens if he likes me?" Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Then you'll be the first." Before Sarah could respond, Arthur knocked once and opened the door. The study was large. Bookshelves lined the walls. A fireplace occupied one corner. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the lake and the rose garden beyond. And beside those windows sat Ethan Blackwell. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Sarah had seen photographs before. Magazine covers. News articles. Television interviews. But the man sitting before her looked very different from the billionaire she'd seen in those pictures. Older. Not in years. In grief. There were dark circles beneath his eyes. Several days' worth of stubble covered his jaw. His shoulders seemed heavier than they should, like he was carrying something invisible, something enormous. Most striking of all were his eyes. They weren't angry. Not exactly. They looked exhausted. The kind of exhaustion sleep could never fix. Arthur quietly left and closed the door behind him. The room became silent. Ethan studied Sarah. Not rudely. Not dismissively. Carefully. As though he were evaluating whether she would become caregiver number 12 to quit. Finally, he spoke. "Sit." Sarah sat. A small digital timer rested on the desk. Ethan pressed a button. 3 minutes appeared on the screen. Sarah wasn't sure whether to find that amusing or concerning. Possibly both. "I'll save us time," Ethan said. His voice was calm. Controlled. Dangerously controlled. "I don't want sympathy." "Okay. I don't want motivational speeches." "Fine. I don't want anyone telling me everything happens for a reason." Sarah nodded. "No problem." A flicker of surprise crossed his face. Most people argued. Most people tried to help. Sarah simply accepted his rules. Ethan continued. "I've had 11 caregivers." "I heard." "Then you know how this usually ends." Sarah folded her hands. "Not necessarily." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Why are you here?" The question was direct. Brutally direct. Sarah appreciated that, because she was too tired for pretending. "I need the job." For the first time, Ethan looked genuinely interested. Not impressed. Interested. "You don't seem embarrassed by that." "I'm not." The answer came immediately. "Most people are." Sarah shrugged. "I have 2 children." Silence. Ethan stared at her. 2. Yes. Ages. 8 and 6. Something changed in his expression. Only slightly. But enough for Sarah to notice. Children. The word seemed to affect him. She wasn't sure why. "What about their father?" Ethan asked. Sarah hesitated, then answered honestly. "He passed away." The room grew quieter. For one brief moment, 2 strangers looked at each other and recognized something familiar. Loss. Not the same loss, but loss all the same. Ethan looked away first. Toward the garden. Toward the roses. Toward whatever memories lived there. Then he asked a question that surprised her. "Do you miss him every day?" Sarah smiled sadly. "Yes." Ethan nodded once. As if that answer made perfect sense. Because it did. The timer continued counting down. 1 minute remaining. Finally, Sarah took a breath. If I get the position, there's something you should know. Ethan looked at her. My children would need to live here with me. The room became very still. Ethan's jaw tightened. Children. Noise. Life. Everything his house no longer contained. For several seconds he said nothing. Sarah wondered if she had just ended the interview. Then Ethan looked toward the window again. The garden. The roses. The memories. Something moved behind his eyes. A thought. A memory. A hesitation. The timer reached 0. A soft beep filled the room. The interview was over. Ethan looked back at Sarah. For a moment neither spoke. Then he said a single word. Monday. Sarah blinked. Monday. 7 o'clock. She stared at him, unsure whether she'd heard correctly. Ethan turned his wheelchair toward the window. The conversation was clearly finished. If anything disturbs my peace, he said quietly, you're gone. Sarah stood. A small smile touched her face. Understood. As she reached the door, Ethan spoke again, without looking at her. What are their names? Sarah paused. My children. Yes. Noah and Emma. For the first time since entering the room, she thought she saw something soften in his expression. Not happiness. Not warmth. Just the faintest crack in a wall that had been standing for a very long time. Then it disappeared. Monday, he repeated. Sarah nodded and left the study. Outside the door, Arthur was waiting. The moment he saw her expression, his eyes widened. You got the job? I think so. Arthur stared at the closed door in disbelief. Then he laughed. Not politely. Not professionally. Genuinely. Well, he said, shaking his head, that's a first. As Sarah walked back toward the front entrance, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. She didn't know it yet. But 3 days from now, she and her children would move into the Blackwell estate. And before a single month had passed, a child with a box of crayons would begin uncovering secrets that adults had spent years hiding. Monday arrived with clear skies and nervous energy. Sarah woke before sunrise. Not because she needed to, because major changes always made sleep difficult. By 6:30 that morning, the last of their belongings had been packed into 3 suitcases, 2 storage bins, and several worn cardboard boxes. It wasn't much. Years earlier, the sight might have embarrassed her. Now it simply reminded her how far she and the children had come. Everything important was still there. The photographs, the memories, the people. The rest was just furniture. Noah carried a backpack nearly half his size. Emma hugged a stuffed rabbit that had lost 1 button eye years ago. Neither child fully understood how much their lives were about to change. To them, it was an adventure. A new house. A new room. A new beginning. Children often see possibilities where adults see risks. By 7 o'clock, a car from the estate had arrived. Arthur himself stepped out to help with the luggage. The drive to the mansion took 40 minutes. The children spent most of it staring out the windows. When the estate finally came into view, Emma's mouth fell open. Mom. Sarah smiled. Yes. Is that where we're living? For now. Emma looked unconvinced. It looks like a castle. Arthur chuckled. Many people say that. Noah leaned forward. Does a billionaire actually live there? Arthur smiled. He does. The boy's eyes widened. A real billionaire? Sarah immediately gave him a look. Noah. What? We don't ask people how much money they have. I wasn't going to. You were absolutely going to. Arthur laughed again. For the first time in a long while, the drive felt light. Normal. The children were still laughing when they entered the mansion. The sound echoed through the large entry hall. For one brief moment, something unusual happened. Several staff members stopped what they were doing. Not because the children were causing problems. Because they were making noise. Happy noise. A sound the house hadn't heard in months. Maybe longer. Arthur showed them to their rooms. The guest suite occupied an entire wing of the first floor. It was larger than Sarah's entire apartment. Emma immediately ran toward the window. Noah discovered a bookshelf and forgot everything else existed. Sarah stood quietly in the doorway. For the first time in years, she felt her shoulders relax. Just slightly. Not enough to stop worrying. Enough to breathe. By 9 o'clock, she reported to the study. Ethan was exactly where she'd expected him to be. Near the window. Looking at the garden. The roses had become even more overgrown. Their beauty hidden beneath neglect. Sarah wondered if he realized how similar that garden was to himself. She wisely kept the thought to herself. Good morning. Ethan glanced at her. Morning. The word sounded more like an obligation than a greeting. Sarah reviewed medications, appointments, schedules, instructions. The morning passed quietly. Then lunch arrived, and everything changed. Because children rarely respect emotional walls, especially walls they cannot see. Emma wandered into the study completely by accident. At least that was her later claim. Sarah suspected otherwise. The little girl stopped directly in front of Ethan's wheelchair, looked up, and stared. Ethan stared back. Several long seconds passed. Neither spoke. Finally, Emma pointed. You look sad. Sarah nearly dropped the tray she was carrying. Oh my goodness, Emma. It's okay, Ethan interrupted. He continued looking at the child. Why do you think I look sad? Emma considered the question carefully. Because your eyes are sad. The room became quiet. Children have a habit of saying things adults spend years avoiding. Ethan looked away first. Back toward the window. Back toward the garden. Back toward the place he always escaped. Emma followed his gaze. What happened to your flowers? Another dangerous question. Sarah was already preparing an apology. Instead, Ethan surprised her. My wife planted them. Emma nodded. Did she move away? The air left the room. Sarah closed her eyes. Ethan remained silent for several moments. Then he answered softly. No. Emma waited. Children always wait. They don't understand when adults are trying to avoid pain. Finally, Ethan spoke again. She died. The little girl's face changed immediately. Not with fear. Not with discomfort. With understanding. A kind of simple understanding only children possess. My daddy died too. Silence. Complete silence. For the first time since arriving, Sarah saw genuine emotion cross Ethan's face. Not anger. Not bitterness. Recognition. Emma nodded as though discussing the weather. I miss him. Ethan swallowed. So do I. The conversation ended there. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just honestly. Emma seemed satisfied. She smiled, then wandered away, leaving two grieving adults sitting in stunned silence. That evening, after dinner, Sarah found Ethan exactly where she expected. Still in the study. Still facing the window. Still staring at the roses. Only now there was a piece of paper resting on his desk. A drawing. Emma's drawing. Sarah picked it up. The picture showed 3 people standing together. A little girl. A woman. And a man in a wheelchair. Above them was a bright yellow sun. Across the bottom, written in large uneven letters, were 5 words. You look less sad today. Sarah smiled. Then she noticed something strange. Ethan had kept it. Every other item children left around the house was eventually moved. Cleaned. Organized. Stored. This drawing remained on the desk. Directly beside him. As if he wanted it there. As if he needed it there. The following morning, something even stranger happened. Arthur was helping Ethan review correspondence when he suddenly stopped speaking. He was staring toward the garden. What is it? Ethan asked. Arthur pointed. Ethan followed his gaze. Near the roses stood Noah and Emma. The children were pulling weeds. Carefully. Patiently. Working together. Sarah stood nearby supervising. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Arthur smiled. I don't believe it. Ethan frowned. What? Arthur nodded toward the garden. The roses. Months of professional gardeners had failed to touch them. Not because they couldn't. Because Ethan wouldn't allow anyone near them. Yet somehow 2 children had walked into the garden on their second day and started helping. Without permission. Without fear. Without realizing they were doing something nobody else had managed to do. Ethan watched silently. A strange expression crossing his face. Then his eyes settled on something else. Near one of the flower beds, partially hidden beneath years of growth, sat a small metal box. Old. Rust-covered. Almost invisible. Ethan frowned. He had never seen it before. Neither had Arthur. And far away, in another part of the city, a man named Marcus Reed was about to receive a phone call that would make him very nervous. Because buried beneath those roses was a secret nobody was supposed to find. The metal box should not have been there. That was the first thing Ethan thought as he stared through the study window. For years, Claire had treated the rose garden like a sacred place. She knew every flower, every plant, every corner of it. If a metal box had been buried among the roses, she would have known. Which meant one of 2 things. Either it had been placed there recently, or Claire had hidden it herself. Neither explanation made Ethan comfortable. Outside, Noah was still pulling weeds while Emma carefully watered a section of roses with a small green watering can Arthur had found in the shed. Neither child realized they had just discovered something important. Sarah noticed Ethan staring. "What is it?" Ethan pointed. "There." Sarah followed his gaze. At first, she didn't see anything. Then sunlight reflected briefly off a rusted edge hidden beneath the overgrowth. A small metal container. Half buried. Almost invisible. Arthur frowned. "I've never seen that before." "Neither have I," Ethan said. The three exchanged a look. Something about the discovery felt strange. The kind of strange that makes people lower their voices without realizing it. Arthur walked outside. A few minutes later, he returned carrying the box. It was smaller than Ethan expected. About the size of a thick book. Covered in dirt. Rust coated most of the surface. There was no lock. No markings. Nothing that identified its owner. Arthur placed it on the desk. Nobody spoke. For reasons none of them could explain. Opening the box suddenly felt important. Almost significant. As though something inside had been waiting a very long time to be found. Finally, Ethan reached forward. The lid creaked as it opened. Inside sat several items. A small notebook. A flash drive. A sealed envelope. And a silver bracelet. The moment Ethan saw the bracelet, his stomach tightened. He recognized it instantly. It belonged to Claire. Years ago, he had given it to her on her birthday. She rarely took it off. Yet somehow it had ended up buried beneath the roses. Sarah noticed the change in his expression. "You know it," Ethan nodded. It was hers. The room became quiet. Arthur carefully picked up the notebook. Most of the pages contained gardening notes. Flower names. Planting schedules. Sketches of future landscaping projects. Typical Claire. Then Arthur stopped turning pages. His expression changed. "What is it?" Ethan asked. Arthur looked up. "There are entries in the back." "About what?" Arthur hesitated, then handed him the notebook. Ethan began reading. At first, the entries seemed ordinary. Observations. Appointments. Personal reminders. Then the tone changed. His heartbeat quickened. The final entries were different. Very different. One read. "I think someone is stealing from the company." Another. "I need proof before I tell Ethan." A third. "If I'm right, this is bigger than I thought." Ethan stared at the page. His hands tightened around the notebook. The room suddenly felt smaller. Hotter. Impossible. Claire had never mentioned any of this. Not once. Sarah leaned forward. "What does it mean?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "I don't know. But he did know one thing. Claire wasn't the type of person to write something down unless she was certain it mattered." Arthur picked up the envelope. The front contained a single sentence written in Claire's handwriting. "If you're reading this, something has gone wrong." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Arthur carefully opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. Ethan unfolded it. The message was short. Painfully short. "Ethan, I hope I'm being paranoid. I truly do. But if you're reading this, then I may have been right. There are financial records that don't make sense. Large transfers hidden inside approved accounts. I've been investigating quietly because I didn't want to worry you until I knew more. I believe someone close to us is involved. Someone we trust. If anything happens to me, don't ignore this. Love always. Claire." Silence filled the study. Complete silence. Sarah looked at Ethan. His face had gone pale. Arthur sat down slowly. The old household manager suddenly looked 10 years older. This can't be real. But it was. The letter sat in Ethan's hands. Claire's handwriting. Claire's words. Claire's warning. Months before her death. Ethan looked toward the flash drive. The final item in the box. Sarah noticed it too. Neither spoke. Arthur swallowed. "We should see what's on it." A few moments later, the drive was connected to a laptop. Several files appeared. Most contained financial records. Spreadsheets. Account summaries. Transfer histories. At first glance, they looked normal. Then Sarah noticed something. A pattern. The same approval signature appeared repeatedly. Again and again. Across multiple transactions. Millions of dollars. Small enough to avoid attention individually. Massive when combined. Arthur leaned closer. His eyes widened. "I know that signature." Ethan looked at him. Arthur hesitated. For the first time since the box was opened, genuine fear entered the room. "Arthur?" The older man swallowed hard. "Those approvals came from executive management. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? Arthur looked directly at him. It means whoever Claire was investigating wasn't a low-level employee. The realization landed heavily. This wasn't simple theft. This wasn't accounting error. Whoever had been moving money had authority, power, access. The kind of access only a handful of people possessed. Ethan's mind immediately began listing names. Executives, partners, senior leadership, people he trusted, people he had known for years. Then one name appeared before all the others. Marcus, his cousin, the man currently overseeing much of the company, the man who handled executive approvals, the man who had been helping him since the accident. Ethan immediately pushed the thought away. No, impossible. Marcus had practically become family. Marcus had attended the funeral. Marcus had supported him through rehabilitation. Marcus had been there every step of the way. And yet, a memory surfaced. The conversation he had overheard weeks earlier. The late-night voices. The secrecy. The strange confidence. We just need more time. Ethan's stomach tightened. For the first time, doubt entered a place where trust had always lived. Sarah noticed the change immediately. What are you thinking? Ethan stared at the files. At Claire's letter. At the evidence she had hidden. Then he answered quietly. I think my wife was afraid of someone. The room grew silent again. Outside, Noah and Emma continued playing among the roses. Laughing. Completely unaware that they had just uncovered the first piece of a mystery that might explain why Claire Blackwell died. And across town, Marcus Reed was finishing a meeting when his phone began to ring. The caller ID displayed a familiar name. One of the company's accountants. Marcus answered casually. Then his expression changed. Within seconds, the color drained from his face. Because the accountant had just informed him that someone had accessed records that were never supposed to be seen again. And for the first time in many months, Marcus Reed felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Fear. Marcus Reed had spent most of his life being underestimated. People noticed Ethan first. They always had. Even as children, Ethan was the one teachers praised, the one coaches admired, the one relatives pointed to when discussing success. Then Ethan became a billionaire. After that, the comparisons only became worse. Marcus learned how to smile through it. He learned how to stand beside greatness while pretending it didn't bother him. And over the years, he became very good at hiding what he felt. Extremely good. Which was why nobody noticed the panic in his eyes after the accountant's phone call. At least nobody except the accountant. Marcus, I'm here. The records were opened. By who? We don't know yet. Marcus stared out the office window. Far below, traffic moved through the city. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. Completely unaware that one phone call could destroy everything he had spent years building. Did they copy anything? We can't tell. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. That answer was almost worse. Because uncertainty creates possibilities. And possibilities create danger. I'll handle it. He ended the call. For several seconds he remained motionless. Thinking. Calculating. Planning. The same way he always did. Then he picked up his keys and headed for the Blackwell estate. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Claire's letter. The words repeated themselves over and over. Someone close to us. Someone we trust. The sentence bothered her. Because grief changes people. But it rarely changes instincts. And Claire's note felt instinctive. Personal. Urgent. As if she'd been genuinely frightened. Sarah sat at the kitchen table reviewing copies of the financial files, while Noah and Emma completed homework nearby. Neither child paid much attention. To them, adults were constantly looking at boring documents. This was nothing unusual. Emma suddenly looked up. Why are you reading papers? Sarah smiled. Just trying to understand something. Emma considered that. Then nodded. As though understanding complicated adult mysteries was perfectly normal. A few moments later, Arthur entered the kitchen. His expression immediately told Sarah something was wrong. What happened? Marcus is here. Sarah glanced toward the hallway. That's a problem? Arthur hesitated. Not necessarily. But he didn't sound convinced. Neither felt reassured. Marcus rarely visited unexpectedly. Especially during weekdays. Usually he scheduled meetings in advance. Today he had arrived without warning. And somehow that felt significant. In the study, Ethan sat facing the window when Marcus entered. His cousin appeared calm. Relaxed. Confident. Exactly as always. But for the first time, Ethan found himself looking closer, watching, evaluating, searching. Grief had blinded him for months. Now he wasn't sure what he had missed. Marcus smiled. "You look better." Ethan said nothing. Marcus sat down across from him. Arthur mentioned the garden. Still nothing. The silence stretched. Marcus shifted slightly. Then his eyes landed on the notebook resting on the desk. The notebook from Claire's box. For a fraction of a second, something flashed across his face. Fear. It disappeared almost instantly. But Ethan saw it. And once you see fear, it's difficult to unsee it. Marcus recovered quickly. "What's that?" Ethan watched him carefully. "Claire's gardening journal." Marcus relaxed. Just slightly. Too slightly for anyone else to notice. Not too slightly for Ethan. The conversation continued. Business updates. Board decisions. Project reports. Normal topics. Normal words. Yet something felt different. Every answer Marcus gave seemed rehearsed. Every smile seemed measured. Every movement seemed deliberate. By the time the meeting ended, Ethan's unease had doubled. After Marcus left, Sarah found him staring at the door. "You think it's him?" It wasn't a question. Ethan looked away. "I don't know." "You suspect him." Ethan exhaled slowly. "That's the problem." "What?" "If it were almost anyone else, I'd already be convinced." Sarah understood immediately. Because betrayal hurts most when it comes from people we trust. Marcus wasn't just family. He was practically a brother. Accusing him felt impossible. Yet the evidence continued pointing in his direction. That evening, another discovery deepened the mystery. Arthur had spent hours reviewing old company records. Most revealed nothing unusual. Then he found a document dated 6 months before the accident. A meeting schedule. At first glance, it seemed harmless. Then he noticed something. Claire's name appeared. Beside it was a note. Meeting cancelled at request of MR. Arthur frowned. MR. Marcus Reed. The cancelled meeting had involved the company's external auditors. The same auditors who might have discovered financial irregularities. Arthur immediately brought the document to Ethan. Within minutes, all three sat together reviewing the evidence. Notebook. Letter. Financial transfers. Cancelled meeting. The pieces were beginning to form a picture. Not a complete picture, but enough to be troubling. Then Sarah noticed something else. A date. The cancelled audit meeting occurred 3 weeks before the crash. The room fell silent. Nobody needed to explain why that mattered. Claire had been investigating financial misconduct. The investigation had been interrupted. Then she died. The sequence felt impossible to ignore. Yet none of it proved murder. Not yet. Just as they reached that conclusion, Emma entered carrying a box of crayons. "I made something." Nobody paid much attention at first. The adults were focused on bigger concerns. Then Emma placed a drawing on the table. And everything changed. The picture showed the Blackwell mansion. The rose garden. Several people standing together. One figure stood apart from the others. A man wearing a dark suit. Sarah smiled. "Who's this?" Emma pointed confidently. "The angry man." Arthur looked confused. "What angry man?" "The one I saw." The room immediately became still. Sarah exchanged a glance with Ethan. "When did you see him?" Emma thought for a moment. "Yesterday." "Where?" "The garden." Ethan frowned. "There was someone in the garden?" Emma nodded. "He was looking at the flowers." "Did he talk to you?" "No." "Then how do you know he was angry?" Emma pointed at the drawing. "Because he looked angry." Children notice things adults miss. Expressions. Tones. Moments. The details nobody thinks matter. Sarah crouched beside her daughter. "What did he look like?" Emma pointed at the sketch again. "He looked like the man in the picture." Arthur leaned closer. His face suddenly hardened. "What is it?" Ethan asked. Arthur didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the drawing. Then he looked up slowly. "There are security cameras covering the garden." The room went silent. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Ethan's heart began beating faster. Because if someone had been in the garden, if someone had been near the roses, if someone had been watching the place where Claire hid the box, then perhaps they weren't dealing with old secrets anymore. Perhaps someone knew the box had been found. And perhaps that someone was getting nervous. Very nervous. Across town, Marcus Reed sat alone in his office. A glass of whiskey rested untouched on his desk. His phone buzzed. A message appeared. "Did you take care of it?" Marcus stared at the screen. For the first time in years, his hands trembled. because things were beginning to unravel. And the closer the truth came, the more dangerous he was willing to become. The security footage was supposed to provide answers. Instead, it created even more questions. By 9 o'clock that night, Ethan, Sarah, and Arthur were gathered in the estate's security office. The room was small, lined with monitors displaying live feeds from different parts of the property. Most of the cameras showed exactly what you'd expect. The front gate, the driveway, the lake, the gardens. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening, nothing that explained why Emma had drawn an angry man standing among Claire's roses. Arthur pulled up footage from the previous day. Let's start here. The screen flickered. Hours of recordings began playing at high speed. Gardeners, delivery vehicles, staff members, birds, rain, wind, nothing. Then Sarah suddenly leaned forward. Stop. Arthur paused the video. A figure appeared near the far edge of the garden, partially hidden by trees. Difficult to see, but definitely there. The room became silent. Arthur zoomed in. The image sharpened slightly. A man, tall, dark suit, standing near the rose beds. Watching. Not working. Not gardening. Just watching. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The timestamp showed 6:17 p.m. Exactly when Emma had been outside. Arthur switched to another camera angle. The man came into clearer view. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Arthur exhaled sharply. Oh my God. Sarah looked at him. What? Arthur pointed at the screen. I know him. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Who is he? Arthur hesitated, as if saying the name aloud might somehow make things worse. Then he answered. Greg Walters. The name meant nothing to Sarah. It meant everything to Ethan. Greg Walters had been the truck driver involved in the accident. The driver who survived. The driver who disappeared shortly afterward. The driver nobody had been able to locate since. The room felt suddenly colder. Sarah stared at the screen. You're sure? Arthur nodded slowly. Absolutely. Ethan couldn't stop staring. For months he had assumed Greg Walters was simply another victim of a terrible accident. A man whose life had also been destroyed that night. Yet here he was, standing in the garden, near the place where Claire's evidence had been hidden. The coincidence was impossible. Sarah voiced what everyone was thinking. Why would he be here? Nobody answered. Because there was only one explanation. And none of them wanted to say it aloud. The footage continued. Greg looked around carefully, as if checking whether anyone was watching. Then he moved toward the rose beds, toward the exact location where the metal box had been buried. He stopped, looked down, and froze. Even through the camera, his reaction was obvious. The box was gone. Someone had found it. Greg remained there for several seconds. Then he turned and hurried away. Arthur immediately switched to the front gate camera. Minutes later, a black sedan exited the property. The license plate was clearly visible. Sarah wrote it down. Arthur contacted a private investigator he trusted. By midnight, they had a name linked to the vehicle. The result stunned everyone. The car wasn't registered to Greg Walters. It belonged to a holding company, one of dozens of companies connected to Blackwell Development. And the executive responsible for overseeing that division? Marcus Reed. Nobody spoke for a long time. The evidence wasn't definitive. But the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every road seemed to lead back to Marcus. Every discovery. Every clue. Every unanswered question. Ethan rubbed his forehead. This doesn't make sense. Sarah looked at him. What part? All of it. He gestured toward the screen. If Marcus wanted money, he already had money. If Marcus wanted power, he already had power. Why would he risk everything? Sarah thought about that, then answered quietly. Because sometimes people don't want more money. Ethan looked at her. They want what belongs to someone else. The words lingered in the room. Uncomfortable. Painfully plausible. The next morning, the investigator called. His voice sounded different. Urgent. There's something you need to hear. Arthur placed the call on speaker. What did you find? The investigator took a breath. Greg Walters isn't missing. Everyone froze. What? He's been living under another name. Sarah felt a chill run through her body. The investigator continued. And there's more. The pause seemed endless. He received a payment 6 days before the accident. Ethan's heart pounded. From who? We're still tracing the source. How much? Another pause. $2 million. Silence. Complete silence. $2 million. No trucking company paid drivers $2 million. No accident settlement happened before an accident occurred. There was only one reason a man like Greg Walters would receive that kind of money. Someone had paid him. The room felt smaller, heavier, more dangerous. The investigator wasn't finished. The payment originated through 3 shell companies. Can you trace them? I'm trying. How long? Maybe a day. Maybe a day. It felt like forever. Because for the first time since Claire's death, the possibility nobody wanted to consider was becoming real. The crash may have been deliberate. That afternoon, Ethan sat alone in the study. The notebook rested on his desk. Claire's letter lay beside it. Outside, Noah and Emma played near the lake. Their laughter drifted through an open window. For months, Ethan had blamed himself. Every day, every night, every waking moment. He had replayed the crash thousands of times. If he had left earlier, if he had driven slower, if he had taken another route, if he had paid more attention, the guilt had become part of him, a permanent wound. Now doubt was beginning to replace it. And oddly enough, doubt hurt too. Because if the crash wasn't an accident, then Claire hadn't simply died. Someone had taken her. Someone had planned it. Someone had looked at the woman he loved and decided her life was expendable. The thought filled him with a kind of anger he hadn't felt in years. Not grief. Not sadness. Anger. Pure anger. For the first time since the accident, Ethan wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about who had taken it. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Sarah entered. She immediately noticed the change in his expression. What happened? Ethan looked toward the garden, then back at her. His voice was calm. Too calm. The investigator found a payment. Sarah nodded. $2 million. I know. Ethan's jaw tightened. If someone did this. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Sarah understood. The room grew quiet. Then Ethan said something that surprised even himself. I'm done sitting still. Sarah stared at him. For months, he had been drifting, surviving, existing. Now something had changed. Purpose had returned. And purpose is a powerful thing, especially in a man who has spent his entire life fighting for what matters. Neither of them realized it yet, but the next piece of evidence was already waiting, hidden inside a forgotten storage locker. A piece of evidence recorded by Claire herself. A recording that would finally reveal the name she had been too afraid to write down. And once they heard it, there would be no turning back. The storage locker had been forgotten for almost a year. At least, that's what everyone believed. It sat on the far side of the city inside a secure facility filled with hundreds of identical metal doors. Nothing about it stood out. Nothing suggested it contained the final piece of a puzzle that had already destroyed multiple lives. The discovery came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the security footage revealed Greg Walters in the garden, Arthur received a phone call. The caller was a woman named Linda Perez. She had worked as Claire's personal assistant for nearly 6 years. After Claire's death, Linda had resigned and moved out of state. Now she sounded nervous. Very nervous. I wasn't sure if I should call. Arthur immediately sensed something important. What happened? Linda hesitated, then spoke carefully. A few months before the accident, Claire rented a storage unit. Arthur sat upright. A storage unit? Yes. Did she tell you why? No. Did she visit often? Not often. Maybe 3 times. Arthur's pulse quickened. Why are you mentioning it now? The answer came softly. Because after she died, I remembered something she said. Arthur waited. Linda took a breath, then repeated the words exactly. If anything ever happens to me, somebody needs to find locker 417. The room went silent. Arthur immediately called Ethan. 2 hours later, Ethan, Sarah, and Arthur stood inside the storage facility. The manager led them down a narrow corridor lined with metal doors. Eventually he stopped. 417. There it was. Small. Gray. Ordinary. The manager unlocked it and stepped away. Nobody moved immediately. Because sometimes people instinctively know when they're standing at the edge of something life-changing. Finally, Arthur pulled the door open. Inside sat only a few boxes. No furniture. No valuables. No hidden fortune. Just documents. Folders. And a small wooden chest. Sarah noticed it first. The chest looked old. Handcrafted. The type of item someone would keep because it meant something emotionally rather than financially. Arthur carefully opened it. Inside was a digital voice recorder. The room became completely silent. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Because suddenly they all knew. Claire had left something behind. The question was what? Arthur picked up the recorder. His hands trembled slightly. A single file appeared on the screen. The date stopped Ethan's heart. It had been recorded 3 days before the crash. 3 days. Arthur pressed play. Static filled the room. Then Claire's voice emerged. Clear. Calm. Familiar. For a moment, Ethan couldn't breathe. It was the first time he had heard her voice in almost a year. Hi, Ethan. The sound hit him like a physical blow. Sarah looked away, giving him privacy he didn't ask for. Claire continued. If you're hearing this, then something has gone wrong. A long pause followed. Not fear. Not panic. Sadness. The sadness of someone preparing for a possibility she desperately hoped wouldn't happen. I hope I'm overreacting. Another pause. I truly hope that's all this is. The recorder crackled softly. Then Claire's tone changed. More serious. More urgent. For months, I've been reviewing company accounts. Ethan closed his eyes. The investigation. The transfers. The hidden payments. Everything was real. Claire continued. At first, I thought it was accounting errors. Then I thought it was fraud. Now I think it's something much worse. Sarah exchanged a glance with Arthur. Neither spoke. Claire took a slow breath. I didn't tell Ethan because I needed proof. And because I didn't want him accusing someone innocent. The room felt smaller with every sentence. Then came the words nobody was prepared to hear. I know who's responsible. Ethan's eyes snapped open. Arthur froze. Sarah's pulse quickened. Claire continued. I've gathered enough evidence to be certain. The recorder crackled again. Then Claire said the name. Marcus Reed. Silence. Absolute silence. Even though they suspected it. Even though the clues pointed toward him. Hearing Claire say it aloud felt different. Final. Real. Devastating. The recording continued. Marcus has been moving money through shell companies for years. I confronted him last week. Sarah looked at Ethan. His face had gone completely pale. Claire's voice trembled slightly. Not with fear. With disappointment. The disappointment of betrayal. He admitted everything. Arthur lowered his head. Claire continued. He begged me not to tell Ethan. The room felt impossibly heavy. Then came the sentence that changed everything. And he threatened me. Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. Claire continued speaking. I don't know what Marcus is capable of. But I know he's desperate. And desperate people are dangerous. The recording stopped briefly. Several seconds of silence followed. Then Claire's voice returned one final time. Softer now. Almost emotional. Ethan. The billionaire's eyes filled with tears. He hadn't cried in months. Not because the pain had disappeared. Because he'd run out of tears. Now they returned all at once. If you're hearing this. Claire paused. Long enough that it felt like she was standing in the room. Looking directly at him. I need you to know something. Another pause. I never blamed you. Ethan closed his eyes. The tears came immediately. Unstoppable. I know you'll blame yourself. I know you'll replay everything. I know you'll carry guilt that doesn't belong to you. Her voice softened further. So listen carefully. What happened wasn't your fault. The room disappeared. The walls. The storage unit. The investigation. Everything. For one brief moment, there was only Claire. Her voice. Her love. Her final gift. The gift of truth. Then the recording reached its final words. I love you. I always will. And then it ended. Nobody spoke. For several minutes, nobody could. Because the truth had finally arrived. And it was worse than they imagined. Marcus hadn't merely stolen money. He had threatened Claire. He had motive. He had opportunity. And now they had proof. But what none of them knew was that Marcus had already realized they were getting close. Very close. Across town, Marcus sat alone in a dark office. A file lay open on his desk. Inside were photographs, security reports, updates, information. And one image in particular held his attention. Sarah, Noah, Emma, living at the estate. As Marcus stared at the photographs, his expression hardened. Because he had spent months protecting his secret. Months covering his tracks. Months believing Ethan was broken. Now everything was falling apart. And desperate men often make desperate choices. The question was no longer whether Marcus was guilty. The question was what he would do next. And the answer was far more dangerous than anyone imagined. The morning after they discovered Claire's recording, nobody at the Blackwell estate slept much. Not Ethan. Not Sarah. not Arthur. The truth had finally surfaced. But truth alone wasn't enough. Truth needed proof. Proof needed action. And action came with risks. Because now they weren't dealing with suspicion anymore. They were dealing with a man who knew he was about to lose everything. And men like that rarely go quietly. Ethan sat in his study before sunrise. The first rays of light stretched across Claire's roses outside the window. For months, he had looked at those flowers and felt only grief. Today he felt something different. Determination. For nearly a year, he had blamed himself for Claire's death. Every morning, every night, every lonely hour in between. Now he understood something he never thought possible. The guilt he carried had been built on a lie. Not a complete lie, but a lie nonetheless. Someone had manipulated events. Someone had hidden the truth. Someone had stolen his wife and then watched him destroy himself with blame. And that realization changed everything. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Sarah entered quietly. She immediately noticed something different. His posture, his expression, even the way he looked out the window. For the first time since she'd met him, Ethan looked alive. Not happy, not healed. Alive. You didn't sleep. He almost smiled. Neither did you. Sarah sat across from him. For a moment neither spoke. Then Ethan looked toward her. You could leave. Sarah frowned. What? This has become dangerous. The words surprised her. Not because they were wrong, because they revealed how much Ethan had changed. Months ago, he barely cared what happened to himself. Now he was worried about someone else. Sarah shook her head. I'm not leaving. Ethan looked away. You have children. So do I. The answer confused him. Sarah smiled softly. What I mean is, if someone threatened Noah or Emma, I'd fight. Ethan understood immediately. Because that's exactly what she was doing. Fighting. Not for money. Not for a job. For people she cared about. And somehow, somewhere along the way, Ethan had become one of those people. Before either could say anything else, Arthur rushed into the room. His face was pale. There's been an arrest. The words landed like thunder. Ethan stared at him. What? Arthur held up his phone. The investigator took Claire's recording and the financial records to federal authorities. Sarah stood. And Arthur swallowed. They arrested Greg Walters this morning. Silence. Then Ethan asked the obvious question. Did he talk? Arthur nodded slowly. Almost immediately, the room went still. Because guilty people often stay silent. But frightened guilty people usually don't. And Greg Walters was frightened. Very frightened. Arthur continued. He admitted he was paid. Sarah felt her heart pound. Ethan's hands tightened on the armrests of his wheelchair. By Marcus. Arthur nodded. The confirmation felt surreal. Even after all the evidence. Even after the recording. Part of Ethan still hadn't wanted to believe it. Now there was no room left for denial. Greg had confessed. The truck had been intentional. The crash had been planned. And Marcus Reed had orchestrated it. The room remained silent. Not because anyone was shocked. Because some truths are too heavy for immediate conversation. Eventually Sarah spoke. What happens now? Arthur looked at his phone again. Then his expression changed. Something wasn't right. What? Arthur hesitated. Marcus is missing. The silence returned instantly. Not the silence of grief. The silence of danger. Authorities had gone to arrest him. His home was empty. His office was empty. His phone was disconnected. Marcus Reed had disappeared. Across the city, that same man sat inside a parked SUV overlooking the Blackwell estate. His eyes remained fixed on the mansion. Months of planning. Years of deception. Millions of dollars. All collapsing. He should have fled. Most people would have. Instead, Marcus couldn't let go. Because greed rarely travels alone. It usually brings pride with it. And pride is often what destroys people in the end. By late afternoon, federal agents arrived at the estate. Additional evidence had surfaced. Bank records. Emails. Witness statements. The case against Marcus was growing stronger by the hour. Then came the final surprise. A phone call. Marcus wanted to surrender. But only under one condition. He wanted to speak to Ethan first. Alone. Everyone objected. Sarah. Arthur. The agents. All of them. Ethan listened quietly. Then agreed. An hour later, Marcus sat across from him in a secure interview room. For several seconds, neither spoke. The cousins simply stared at each other. One carrying grief. The other carrying defeat. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. Why? Marcus laughed bitterly. Not because anything was funny, because there was nothing else left. You always got everything. Ethan stared at him. Marcus continued. The attention, the opportunities, the company, the respect. His voice cracked. I spent my whole life standing in your shadow. The words echoed through the room. Years of resentment compressed into a single confession. Ethan listened, then shook his head slowly. You had a choice. Marcus looked away. Maybe for the first time he understood that. Maybe not. Eventually the interview ended. Marcus was taken into custody. The investigation continued. The trials lasted months. The convictions followed. And little by little, the truth became public. The world learned what happened. The stolen money. The conspiracy. The planned crash. The betrayal. But the story didn't end there. Because justice and healing are not the same thing. 1 year later, the Blackwell estate looked very different. The roses were blooming again. The gardens were alive. The hallways no longer felt empty. Laughter had returned. Mostly because 2 children refused to let silence stay too long. Noah was taller. Emma still drew pictures. Hundreds of them. Many featured a certain billionaire. Though now he was usually smiling. Physical therapy had produced results nobody expected. Ethan wasn't fully recovered. But he was walking short distances with assistance. Each step felt like a victory. Not because it erased the past. Because it proved the past hadn't won. One evening, he stood beside Claire's roses watching the sunset. Sarah joined him. For a while neither spoke. The lake shimmered beneath golden light. The garden swayed gently in the breeze. Peaceful. Finally Sarah looked at him. What are you thinking? Ethan smiled. A genuine smile. The kind that had once seemed impossible. For a long time, I thought losing Claire was the end of my life. He looked toward the roses. Then toward the mansion. Then toward the laughter of Noah and Emma drifting from inside. But sometimes life surprises you. Sarah followed his gaze. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt something stronger than grief. Not happiness. Not relief. Gratitude. Because while tragedy had taken much from him, it had not taken everything. The truth had survived. Justice had survived. And somehow, against all odds, hope had survived too. The crash had lasted less than 3 seconds. The silence afterward had lasted years. But eventually, even the longest silence comes to an end. And sometimes, when it does, you discover that life still has a few beautiful chapters left to write. In the end, Ethan Blackwell's story reminds us that pain can silence a person, but it does not have to bury them forever. Sometimes healing comes from the people we least expect, and sometimes the truth we fear is the very thing that sets us free. This story also teaches us that betrayal may hide behind a familiar face, but lies do not stay buried forever. What is done in darkness will one day come to light. And most importantly, never underestimate kindness. Sarah did not enter Ethan's life as a hero. She came with her own pain, her own struggles, and 2 children to protect. Yet her courage, patience, and compassion helped bring light back into a house that had forgotten how to live. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments which lesson stood out to you the most. And don't forget to like, share, subscribe to Super Storytelling, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next emotional story.